There's a version of the Middle East conflict that most people understand instinctively. Missiles fly, targets are struck, air defenses are tested, and the world watches the military exchange unfold on satellite imagery and breaking news feeds. But there's a second version of the same conflict. Quieter, slower to develop, and ultimately more consequential for the daily lives of more people, that plays out not in the skies over Iran or Israel, but on factory floors in Guangdong, in power generation plants outside Mumbai, and in the shipping schedules of cargo terminals in Yokohama and Busan. This version of the conflict has no dramatic imagery. It has energy invoices, spot market prices, and manufacturing cost structures. And it is in this version that the February 28th escalation has already begun its most durable damage. The foundational geographic reality of the global energy system is one that most consumers in the United States and Europe encounter only as an abstraction. The Strait of Hormuz, a waterway 21 nautical miles wide at its narrowest point, positioned between the Iranian coastline and the Omani exclave of Musandam, carries approximately 21 million barrels of crude oil per day through its passage. That figure represents roughly 20% of global petroleum consumption handled in a single transit corridor. But the significance of that number is not distributed evenly around the world. When analysts describe Hormuz as a critical global choke point, what they are describing in practice is primarily an Asian energy problem. The United States, through the combination of its domestic shale production revolution and its strategic pivot toward Western Hemisphere energy sourcing, has materially reduced its direct dependence on Persian Gulf crude over the past 15 years. U.S. imports from the Persian Gulf region now represent a relatively small fraction of total American oil consumption, a structural shift that the shale boom of the 2010s made possible. Europe, while more exposed than the United States, has its own combination of North Sea production, Norwegian pipeline supply, and following the post-2022 energy restructuring, a diversified LNG import infrastructure that provides meaningful alternatives to Middle Eastern supply. Asia does not have these alternatives. China, the world's largest crude oil importer by volume, sources approximately 40 to 45% of its total oil imports from Middle Eastern producers, with Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE representing its three largest single-country suppliers. In absolute terms, China imports roughly 11 million barrels per day, meaning that somewhere between 4.5 and 5 million barrels of daily Chinese supply move through or originate in the Persian Gulf region. India, the world's third largest oil importer, is even more concentrated in its Middle Eastern dependency. Approximately 60% of India's crude oil imports, and a substantial majority of its LNG supply, transits through or originates from the Persian Gulf. Japan and South Korea, both economies almost entirely devoid of domestic hydrocarbon resources, depend on the Gulf for between 85 and 95% of their crude oil imports, respectively. These are not marginal dependencies. They are the structural energy foundations of the four largest manufacturing economies in Asia. And when the maritime insurance architecture governing Persian Gulf transit collapses, as it did in the hours following the February 28th retaliatory exchanges, the consequence for these four economies is not an inconvenience. It is the functional equivalent of an energy embargo imposed not by political decree but by actuarial mathematics. The mechanism by which a military exchange in the Persian Gulf translates into an energy crisis in Asian manufacturing operates through a sequence that is worth examining with precision. Step 1 is the insurance freeze, which has been documented in the preceding analysis. Underwriters halt new war risk policy issuances for Gulf transit. Tanker operators cannot legally or financially proceed without coverage. Loadings at Gulf terminals slow, then stop. The physical oil does not disappear. It remains in the ground or in onshore storage, but its movement toward the buyers who depend on it is interrupted. Step 2 is the spot market repricing. Asian refiners and state energy companies that operate on just-in-time or near just-in-time inventory models, which describes the dominant procurement philosophy of Chinese, Japanese, and South Korean energy buyers, immediately face the prospect of supply gaps within their operational planning windows. The response is a bidding war on alternative sources. West African crude, from producers including Nigeria, Angola, and Gabon, becomes immediately more attractive, but is subject to its own supply constraints and longer voyage times to Asian destinations. U.S. Gulf Coast crude, available through expanded LNG and crude export terminals, requires trans-Pacific voyages of 20 to 25 days, a timeline that cannot address a supply gap that is measured in days, not weeks. Russian crude, which Chinese refiners have been purchasing at discounted prices since Western sanctions created a captive seller, faces its own logistical constraints and political sensitivities that limit its capacity to serve as a complete substitute. The result of Step 2 is a spot price spike that falls heaviest on Asian buyers, precisely because Asian buyers have the fewest credible alternatives and the most concentrated exposure to the disrupted supply corridor. In the days following the February 28th exchanges, spot market assessments for crude grades delivered to Asian ports reflected a significant premium above comparable grades available to European or American buyers. This differential, sometimes called the Asian premium, has appeared in various forms throughout the history of Gulf supply disruptions. During the first Gulf War, Asian buyers paid premiums above Western peers due to their higher structural dependence on Gulf supply. During the period of peak Houthi Red Sea disruptions in early 2024, LNG spot prices for Asian delivery spiked well above European equivalents as cargo diversion to longer Cape of Good Hope routes tightened supply to East Asian terminals. The February 28th scenario represents a disruption at the source rather than along the transit route, a categorically more severe constraint because there is no alternative route to offer. If the Red Sea is closed, ships can round Africa. If the Strait of Hormuz is closed, Gulf crude cannot leave the Gulf by sea at all. Saudi Arabia's East-West pipeline, which carries crude from the Gulf Coast to the Red Sea port of Yanbu, represents the only meaningful overland bypass. Its current operational capacity of approximately 5 million barrels per day, and its actual throughput of closer to 1.7 million barrels per day, is sufficient to provide partial relief for Saudi exports, but is entirely inadequate to substitute for the 21 million barrels per day that the strait normally handles. For China, Japan, India, and South Korea combined, the practical implication of a Hormuz disruption lasting more than a few weeks is a drawdown of strategic petroleum reserves at rates those reserves were designed to sustain only temporarily. China's strategic petroleum reserve, currently the largest in Asia, holds an estimated 900 million barrels across both government-controlled and commercial storage. At normal consumption rates, this represents roughly 90 days of supply. But normal consumption rates assume that the refinery and industrial complex consuming that oil is operating at full capacity under normal economic conditions. A supply disruption of this severity does not leave refinery throughput at normal levels. It triggers immediate downstream rationing decisions that themselves generate economic costs. The translation of an energy supply shock into manufacturing cost inflation follows a transmission pathway that is well documented in economic literature but rarely communicated clearly to general audiences. The immediate impact falls on energy-intensive manufacturing processes. Steel, cement, aluminum, petrochemicals, and fertilizers. These industries power heavy construction, automotive supply chains, agricultural input production, and the plastics and packaging systems that support virtually all consumer goods manufacturing. A 30% increase in industrial electricity costs, which is a conservative estimate for an economy facing a severe crude supply disruption while drawing on spot market alternatives at elevated prices, translates into margin pressure across all of these sectors simultaneously. Chinese manufacturers operating on already thin margins in sectors including electronics, appliances, textiles, and machinery face a binary decision under these conditions: absorb the cost increase against existing margins or pass it through to buyers. In practice, the decision is rarely binary. Manufacturers attempt to absorb what they can while passing through the remainder, which means that the inflationary signal entering the global supply chain is distributed and delayed rather than arriving all at once. This distribution and delay is precisely why energy-driven supply chain inflation is so difficult to track in real time and so persistent once it takes hold. The first wave of cost pass-through reaches global buyers within 4 to 6 weeks of the originating supply disruption, roughly the time required for open purchase orders to be fulfilled at old pricing, while new orders begin reflecting revised cost structures. The second wave, as existing long-term contracts come up for renewal under new cost conditions, arrives over a period of 3 to 6 months. The third wave, the full repricing of supply chains as manufacturers invest in energy efficiency, alternative sourcing, or production restructuring in response to the new energy cost environment, plays out over 1 to 3 years. American and European consumers, who are the ultimate buyers of the goods moving through the Eastern manufacturing complex, experience these waves as successive rounds of price increases that appear disconnected from the original geopolitical event because of the time delays involved. This is why the inflationary consequences of Middle Eastern energy disruptions are consistently underestimated in real time and consistently more persistent than initial forecasts suggest. The 1973 oil embargo provides the most studied historical precedent for this transmission mechanism. When OPEC members led by Saudi Arabia imposed an embargo on the United States and the Netherlands in October 1973, the immediate market response was a quadrupling of crude oil prices within 3 months. But the inflationary consequences of that price shock cascaded through the global economy for the better part of a decade, feeding the stagflationary environment of the mid to late 1970s through successive rounds of cost pass-through in manufacturing, transportation, agriculture, and services. The February 28th context differs from 1973 in important structural ways. The US is far less energy dependent than it was in 1973, which limits the direct domestic impact on American consumers through energy prices specifically. But the US economy of 2026 is far more exposed to Asian manufacturing cost inflation than the US economy of 1973 was, because the degree to which American consumer goods production has been offshored to the Eastern manufacturing complex is categorically greater. In 1973, the inflationary shock entered the American economy primarily through domestic energy prices. In 2026, the same geographic disruption enters the American economy through the cost of manufactured goods, electronics, appliances, vehicles, clothing, pharmaceuticals, and the enormous range of consumer products whose production has been concentrated in Asia over the past 4 decades. The Federal Reserve faces a monetary policy environment under these conditions that is structurally uncomfortable. Supply-side inflation, the kind driven by cost, increases moving through supply chains rather than by excess demand in a domestic economy, does not respond to interest rate increases in the way that demand-driven inflation does. Raising rates slows domestic demand and reduces borrowing, which can moderate inflation when inflation is being driven by consumers spending more than an economy can produce. But raising rates does not reduce the cost of crude oil on Asian spot markets, does not reopen Hormuz to tanker traffic, and does not lower the electricity bills of Chinese industrial facilities running on emergency reserve supply. The supply-side inflation that a Hormuz disruption sends through the Eastern manufacturing complex and into Western consumer markets is, in a meaningful sense, immune to the primary tool that central banks use to combat inflation. This is the mechanism by which a regional military conflict in the Persian Gulf transmits its costs to households in Ohio, Bavaria, and Osaka, with no direct connection to the conflict itself. The family in Ohio does not purchase Iranian crude or hold maritime insurance policies. It purchases the goods manufactured by factories that purchase the power generated by the refineries that process the crude that no longer flows through the Strait of Hormuz. Every link in that chain is separated from the next by contracts, time delays, and multiple layers of market intermediation. The connection is real, but it is invisible in the way that infrastructure is always invisible, noticed only when it fails. There's a concept in systems analysis called the hidden load, the weight that a structure is bearing that does not appear in any single component's stress reading, but that is distributed across the entire system and becomes visible only when one component fails, and the redistribution exceeds other components' tolerances. The global energy system's dependence on the Strait of Hormuz is the hidden load of the global economy. It is present in every price, every supply chain, every manufacturing cost structure of every product in every store. It is invisible when Hormuz functions normally, which it has done for most of the past century. It becomes suddenly comprehensively visible when the insurance markets that allow tankers to transit the strait freeze, when the spot markets that clear alternative supply spike to levels that compress industrial margins, and when the strategic petroleum reserves that were designed to buffer short disruptions begin depleting at rates that signal the disruption is not short. What the February 28th escalation has demonstrated, through a mechanism that requires no military expertise to understand, only an understanding of how supply chains and energy systems are structured, is that the geography of conflict and the geography of consequence are not the same. The conflict is in the Persian Gulf. The consequence is in Guangdong and Mumbai and Yokohama and on the price tags of goods and shopping centers that are thousands of miles from the nearest missile battery. This geographic decoupling of conflict and consequence is the defining feature of warfare in a hyper-integrated global economy. It means that the relevant question about a Middle Eastern military escalation is not only what it does to the forces directly involved, it is what it does to the energy cost structure of the world's manufacturing base. It is what it does to the inflation trajectory of economies whose monetary authorities have no policy tool adequate to the supply-side shock they are about to absorb. It is what it does to the political economies of governments that will be held responsible by their citizens for price increases that originated in a military exchange they had no part in and no ability to prevent. A regional war in the Persian Gulf, in the economic architecture of 2026, is not a localized event contained by geography. It is a global tax, levied not by any government or institution, but by the structural reality of a world that built its manufacturing base, its consumer economy, and its just-in-time supply system on the assumption that 21 million barrels of oil would continue flowing through a 21 nautical mile strait without interruption. That assumption is now being tested, and the bill for testing it will be distributed across every economy connected to the global supply chain, which is to say, every economy on Earth, in the weeks and months ahead. Whether the disruption is resolved quickly or persists into a prolonged supply crisis, the economic signal is already moving through the system. It is in the spot market premiums paid by Asian refiners this week. It is in the purchase orders being revised by Chinese manufacturers this month. It is in the shipping schedules being rewritten by cargo carriers across the Pacific this quarter. And it will arrive, with the precision and inevitability of compound interest, in the price of the next appliance, the next vehicle, the next pharmaceutical order, that a consumer in a country that never heard a missile launch places without any understanding of what moved the number on the price tag. This is the Asian margin call. It was issued in the skies over the Persian Gulf on February 28th, 2026. It will be paid in installments by the global economy for considerably longer.